you are all joining me here today to hear from our guest, author Kim Coleman Foote. Oh, yes, please. A little about Kim. She hails from New Jersey, where she began her writing career around the age of 7. Since 7, Kim has become an award-winning author, and her work, which focuses on African American history, slavery, relationships between Africa and its diaspora, and intersections of race, gender, and class, has appeared in the Best American Short Stories 2022, Iron Horse Literary Review, Ecotone, and The Rumpus, among other publications. Kim has also won and participated in writing fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, New York Foundation for the Arts, Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown, Phillips Exeter Academy, Center for Fiction, Breadloaf, MacDowell, and Hedgebrook. Kim's debut novel, Coleman Hill, was named a finalist, here we go, for sale, as all of our authors' books are, right out front after the event. It was named a finalist for the Carol Shields Prize for Fiction, NAACP Image Award, and Audi Award, and was longlisted for the Center for Fiction First Novel Prize. This book is a work of fiction, but it was heavily inspired by Kim's own family, specific family members and their stories of coming to Vauxhall, New Jersey from Alabama and Florida during the period in US history known as the Great Migration. So welcome, Kim, and we are thrilled to have you with us for the 2025 Nantucket Book Festival.
Thank you so much to the Nantucket Book Festival for having me here. It's such a delight, 2 years after my book has come out, to still be on the road and promoting and sharing my work with people. And thank you all for coming here. And yes, during lunch hour, I hope this will be filling in a way that, food is. I'm going to just read briefly from the beginning of the book. As Kaley mentioned, this is inspired by my real-life family, who is on the cover, on the spine, and there are pictures throughout the book as well. So this first section is entitled Exodus, and it's from the perspective of characters inspired by my 2 great-grandmothers who moved up to New Jersey from Alabama and Florida. Exodus, circa 1916. This, the earliest things we knew, running barefoot on white Florida sand and red Alabama clay, sleeping beneath hairy oaks and climbing them when we pleased. Clothes was rags and we hardly had shoes, but it was hot most of the time, heat rubbing up against you like a drenched dog. Ain't have electricity or fans or ice the first, so we cooled off in the creek. Life was all about playing and sweating and splashing and hollering and the buzz of June bugs in the summertime, the grunt of pigs sneaking under the house, the wake-up calls of cows, mules, and roosters, our mamas yelling from the porch, "Y'all come on in and get your supper now." Then we turned 5, and they started us in the fields. We trailed our mamas and daddies down the rows, pulling up weeds, going to and from the well for water. It got so that we hated that heat and the sun, the dirt, that thing called work. But soon it got to be like a game of sorts with us children, seeing who could outrace the other. Then we turned 7 and picked our first cotton. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. My first question is about grounding us in your novel, and I think that you really did just ground us in the beginning where your characters start in the South. And so I want to move into a term that you use when describing your book, biomythography, a term coined by Audre Lorde, and it really perfectly encapsulates the work that you've done. Can you first please define biomythography for us, and then let us know a little bit about the specific instant or really an artifact that was the genesis of this story, of this novel?
So I was trying to figure out what to call this because I'm a fiction writer to the core. My very first story that I wrote at about age 7 was a short story, or flash fiction, I guess you would call it nowadays. It was from the perspective of a little boy. I was not born a boy. And he was a black boy, but very, very pale-skinned. So fiction has always been my thing, imagining other people's lives. But I had always wanted to write about my family in some way because of the stories that I've been hearing about them since I was a little girl. Very colorful, entertaining stories, infuriating stories as well. And I didn't know if that would take the form of memoir or fiction, or I just didn't know. And so that's actually the impetus was a photograph during my MFA program. I had a class assignment to write a story based on a photograph. And I chose this one, if you want to, I think it's on page 22 maybe. I chose one of my grandfather's 3 sisters when they were little girls. And for some reason, the one in the middle, her voice literally just spoke to me. She has this kind of evil expression on her face. And she's squeezing this poor little dog half to death. And the other 2 sisters looked terrified. And I was like, what the heck was behind this picture? And literally her voice just spoke to me saying, I ain't afraid of that man or his camera. And I was like, I'm sure you're not. And then her voice just kept pouring and pouring and pouring. And I was like, oh, what is this? And so I got a notebook and just started writing longhand what I was hearing. And when I write fiction, I never hear words. You know, I have a lot of friends who are poets, and it's all about the word comes first. But I never hear words. I always see movies in my head that I then have to translate into words. So this was a really interesting experience where these words just came, and the whole thing came out in about 10 minutes, and I was done. And, you know, I had been kind of seeking, I guess, ancestral permission to write about my family, because who am I to put my family's dirt on the street? But, you know, I was writing a memoir at the same time, so I was happy to share my own dirt. But who am I to put out my family's, you know, traumas and dramas on the page? And so for me, this was like my ancestral permission. This was the door opening saying, go through, you can do it. And so that's what I had intended to do. And so now, because it's a mix of, you know, family stories, truth, you know, from various members of my family, but also mixing in my imagination, you know, of what was happening. I don't even know the official dates for a lot of these photographs, so I had to kind of imagine, you know, based on the clothing, et cetera, what year they might have been. I was like, well, it's not fiction completely, it's not nonfiction completely. And then I realized, oh yes, of course, Alex Haley did this with Roots, you know, with his own family, fictionalizing from Africa and the slave trade and so forth. But Alex Haley called it faction. And I was like, I just don't like that word. Alex Haley, you're a master, but I don't like that word. And then I remembered, I was reading during my MFA program, Audre Lorde's memoir, Zami, which she actually called the biomythography. And before I read it, I was like, okay, what is this? I don't do experimental writing. Like, I just like straightforward. But when I read her memoir, I was like, okay, there's no aliens, there's no time, there's no, you know, anything speculative. It just reads like a regular, you know, recount of someone's life. But then I realized that she was using this term to describe a work of art that combines many sources to create a modern myth, a new history. And I was like, yeah, because I'm using stories. I'm a genealogist for my family. I've been doing genealogy long before I even had an idea for a book, you know, collecting census records, birth records, all kinds of, you know, governmental records on my family, photographs that people have been giving me or, you know, found in my family, and kind of combining all those elements to create literally a modern myth, a new history, you know, because when people ask, well, what is this book? Is it fiction? Yes, it is fiction, because like I said, I had to fill in the gaps. Some of these members of my family I know very, very little about. You know, Coleman, who is my great-grandmother, who's on the spine, I know a lot about her because she featured in my family stories. But some of the other characters, family members, I knew very, very little about. So I had to really build three-dimensional, fully formed human beings out of just like literally a snippet.
Well, yes, and you do it so beautifully, and that's why I love that phrase, or that word, biomythography, because I think it so perfectly captures what you do, which is fairly unique, I think, in a novel telling. And I love it too because, you know, you draw on history to tell this story, but it's so much of oral history from your family. It's so much of interpretations from photographs, like you said. So there's historical, there's family family history, family nuggets of lore there, but even in our own family histories, I'm sure you all know you have stories that have been passed down, your grandparents, your great-grandparents, such and such, and it morphs over time. They're told verbally, and so you can't even count on those as strict history records. So to even take that, it's almost like you've taken that a step further to fill in the gaps based on this oral history you've had from your family. And maybe you could speak a little bit more about that. What maybe there were, and I don't want to go too far ahead because I do have a lightning round in mind in a little bit, but what was it like to build out these characters? And so they are characters. This is a novel, and yet you start with little pieces of story, of history, and how do you go from there? How do you build out a fully fledged character from a certain story or a certain image?
So, like I said, it started with that one story, which is focused on my great aunt. And from there, I started writing 3 separate stories. And one is actually featuring this photograph on the cover. One of these is my mother.
You have to guess which one when you take a look at the book.
Who do I look like? But this photograph, made me think of a story that my mother didn't share with me until I was in my early 20s. And she's like, "Oh, I never told you that story." I was like, "Ma, I think I would remember if you told me that you and your siblings and cousins plotted to kill your grandmother." I think I would remember that from childhood. That was not one of the many stories that you told us about Greg Coleman. So that one I was like, okay, this will be easy because literally they had about 4 methods that they literally sat around and plotted to kill her. They had about 4 methods that they discussed. So I was like, okay, I'll just take it method by method by method. And in my version of the history, they're going to try because in reality, they just sat around and talked about it, but they didn't attempt it. And I was like, you know what, because I've always wanted to get back at this woman myself, they are going to try. So I was like, that'll be one. And then my great-grandfather, one of my great-grandfathers, the only thing that I knew about him was that he died of lockjaw, working on a building. He was in construction, whether it was a rusty nail, a rusty pipe. That's literally all I know. He died of lockjaw working in a building. And so I wanted to talk about that experience because one of the impetuses behind this book, there are several, but one was the fact that my 2 great-grandmothers, whose excerpt I read from, when they came to Jersey, their husbands died within a couple of years after. And these are 2 women, they had about 5 kids each. They were domestics. Imagine coming from a whole different place to the north, and you've lost your husband, and you have all these kids to raise by yourself. What was that experience like for them? And so the fact that he died of lockjaw, that always just since I was a kid, just the fact that you can't open your mouth, that just really horrified me. And so I wanted to know what that experience was like for her to have her husband die. So I started literally with her, sorry, spoiler, well, you know now, but with her being in the hospital, and literally the first line was, "He is dead." And she walks into the hospital and she's collecting his overalls, and they're empty because obviously he's not there, And then I started another story that was a triptych, and it was looking at alcoholism within the family. So there were three women in particular, my great-grandmother, my great-aunt, and my aunts who suffered from alcoholism. And so I wanted to show, okay, where did that come from? And also show how history just was repeating itself, because these were all women who'd been young girls, who'd been defiant, who looked at other people who, let's say, had alcoholism. That won't be me. I won't be a silly drunk. I won't be blah, 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 blah. And then they end up, repeating that same pattern. And so I was looking at the 3 of them in tandem. So, it was, again, I had these things that really struck me, but then also seeing the patterns within my family that I wanted to explore. And that's how the stories came to be one by one.
Yeah, well, you just touched on so many things there that, again, which I think are so unique and special to your novel and the way that you tell, again, your family story, but also a new story. And, I'm really struck, as you're speaking, thinking of the episodic nature of your novel. I think it's unique in that we don't necessarily just follow a main character or two main characters through a certain amount of time with like your very typical rising, falling action and a conclusion with a neat bow at the end. I mean, we do get some closure at the end, but we also are left with a lot of some openness, not non-closure, though you leave us with some hope for the future generations. No spoilers.
There's hope. I'm sitting here.
Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about this structure for the novel, how you, like you said, you start with this, well, I won't call him your, but the lockjaw episode and the death, and it's like a very clear moment in time. And then you move into some other wild stories, but they're all moments in time. We have Lucy Grimes, who kicks out her mother-in-law the second that, not the second, but shortly after her husband passes away, the meanest woman in the South. She sends her packing with a one-way ticket back down south. We have episodes where Coleman is, very violent, pushes down her pregnant daughter-in-law down the stairs. But we have Nell, who takes her sister's children out to Coney Island and, just cries in her car because she can't adopt them. So we have these very specific stories, but you tell the entire novel in that way through very specific stories. And I know from our previous conversations that you consider yourself a bit of a novel purist, and apparently had to be convinced by her editor that this was in fact a novel. And so can you tell us a little bit about that? How did your editor convince you that you had a novel on your hands here?
Yeah, so like I said, I don't do experimental. I'm not trying to reinvent any wheels. I'm a storyteller. I come from storytellers, right? And so I started, that first story came at 7. I started writing, I guess, what I would call novels when I was probably 12 or 13. And I did that all the way through high school. I was writing some short stories in high school, but I really loved the long form. I loved, the arc of the novel. And I also love multi-voice novels. I liked having the two characters, and one novel that I wrote when I was in high school had about maybe 8 characters, because I feel like there's not one story. You see all different angles of a story. So I really love that juxtaposition of different voices. And so when I started writing Coleman Hill, I was just thinking of them as, again, stories. Not even short stories, because I hadn't really written a short story since I was in high school. And I had to even tell myself, you're just writing a story, to kind of disassociate, because I'm like, what does a short story look like? I don't really know. Contemporary short stories, I don't really like them so much. So you're just writing a story. And they were all, non-chronological. Like I said, that one about my great-grandfather's death, it literally started with the scene, he is dead. That's where it started, because that's where I felt my energy. And I just wrote these scenes. And my writing group, they're like, Kim, this is confusing. We can't, this jumps over here. I was like, okay, let me just make it chronological. Solve the problem, great. I'm not trying to reinvent any wheels. So now we end up with this, it's coming together as a book. There's enough stories, I think, that will make a whole manuscript. And at some point along the way, I read, if anyone's read Olive Kitteridge, Elizabeth Strout's book, which, to me, I was like, this is a short story collection. I looked on, it's linked. There's a lot of linked collections, but there's been this whole trend within the past, I think, 20 years in publishing where they're saying it's a novel, but I'm like, it's a short story collection. Yes, we've had linked collections set in the same town or, featuring the same characters, and I didn't consider that a novel. But what that book taught me was the fact that I could center my book around Coleman, because Coleman was like Olive. Olive was such a force in that book. She's such a curmudgeon. She's such a, and it's I think only one of the stories was narrated from her perspective. And I was like, oh, I see why she did that, because if it's called Olive Kitteridge, but if the whole book had been from her perspective, you probably would have thrown it across the room on chapter 2, because you're like, I can't take this woman anymore. She's just, And I realized that Coleman was like that for my family and my family's stories. She was that kind of center, but that kind of dark mass energy center that everything revolved around.
And for those who are going to read the book after this session, Coleman is your great-grandmother.
My great-grandmother, who's literally there.
Matriarch of the family in a lot of ways. Yes.
And so, I had...
For grandmother Coleman.
Grandmother, that's grandmother Coleman. As little children were taught to say, you call her grandmother Coleman. They're like, Coleman? Okay. But I had been interested in looking, for example, at the relationships between the Eastern or European immigrants that were coming to Vauxhall, New Jersey at that time, and the African Americans from the South, because my mother always told me, like, oh yeah, when we grew up, there wasn't really like a sense of racism. You could there were Lithuanians across the street. It was an open door policy. They treated us better than family. We could just walk in, she'd have food on the table for us. You can go in the fridge as long as you clean your hands, eat whatever in the fridge. They would go to families' homes. Oh, don't touch anything, sit on the floor, put napkins on your lap, that type of thing. So, I really wanted to look at that relationship. So many other things, but once I realized that Coleman was the kind of center, some of those themes dropped out, and that's how I was able to build this narrative around her. And how did I get convinced? So 2 things happened. It was actually my agent who called me, but it was also my publishing team, because they're like, at first they put a biomythography on the cover, and my agent at first, she was like, oh yeah, because I'm like, I don't want to call this a novel. I'm adamant, because the thing is, I don't want to...
We want to sell it, right?
They wanted to sell it. I mean, I do too, of course. But my big thing was, I don't want to mislead my readers, right? Because again, I'm a novel purist. My life is kind of boring. It might not seem that way, but it's kind of boring. And I like to read these long narratives and just like, I'm living vicariously through someone's life. This is so wonderful. And so when I get a book like this, and it's like, oh wait, I have to jump and I have to shift because this one is a new character, and this one is a new character, and this is a new character. I just wanted to make it clear to my readers, like, this is what you're getting. Because I don't want to read the, the reader's comments saying like, this is not a novel. This is it's all different characters. There's too many characters. I'm just like, I get it. Trust me, I get it. But then, yes, so my publisher, they were like, we want to sell this book. People are getting confused. What's a biomythography? Ooh, that's interesting, but what is it? Is it memoir? Is it blah, blah, blah? Okay, fine. But then my mother was the nail in the coffin, because one day, it was before the book came out, she was reading the galleys. And she was like, I was like, oh, where are you reading? She's like, oh, I'm somewhere in the middle. And she's like, I'm kind of skipping. I was like, you're doing what? She's like, yeah, because I know all the stories. And I'm like, but you're doing what? You can't skip around. You have to read it from the beginning to the end. And I was like, oh, okay.
You did write a novel.
It is a novel, because it is written in a way that, by chapter 3, you know who these characters are. By the end of the book, you know all of these references that are mentioned. So you cannot read it out of order. It has to be read from beginning to end. So fine, I'll take it. It's a non-traditional novel, as my agent explained. Yes.
Leave it to Mom to put that nail in the coffin, drive it home. Now, switching a little bit, the women in this story are so strong and resilient. The Coleman women, the Grimes women, in their own different ways. Yet there is a lot of violence in this book. There's a lot of physical violence, a lot of emotional violence, and you write very vivid scenes about this violence. And heads are smashed, horrible insults are thrown, pregnant women are accosted. It's, and sometimes it is hard to look straight at violence like that. But I'm particularly interested in how you see the women in the book and in your family, though the characters in the book that you've written, both modeling resilience while at the same time perpetuating cycles of trauma. And how do the two go hand in hand? And why was it important for you not to shy away from depicting that violence in sometimes really full force and really vivid imagery in the writing, in the way that you portray it?
Yeah, so I was fascinated by these strong women because I was that strong little girl, that little, and I admired them on the one hand because I'm like, oh wow, Coleman, she was like 5 foot tall, petite, and she had men afraid of her in town. Like everyone, oh yes, Miss Coleman, yes, Miss Coleman. Like everyone was like, deferent to her. And then to learn about my other great grandmother. In the book, she's called Stella Grimes. This is someone who was born enslaved, right? And she lived in deep, deep South Alabama, which I visited in modern times, and I was afraid to get out of the car when we saw, because I'm like, all these Confederate flags and dogs, and I'm just like, I'm not getting. And she lived there in 1900. And this woman, what I learned later, basically had a white man put a shotgun in her face because his pigs came and rooted under her house, and she got tired of that. And she took boiling water, as I was told by my family, and threw it on his pigs. And when I found them on the census, they were the only black family living for miles. So they were surrounded by white people. And Jim Crow, like Alabama, George Wallace grew up just 2 miles from there. I saw where he lived, right? And the white man came and put a gun in her face. And she looked down the barrel and said, pull it. And I was like, oh my God. So, I admired this bravery, these strong women. But at the same time, I saw how they also took that defiance and energy and put that same thing on their family, or their in-laws who they despised. And so for me, that kind of, what do you call it?
A duality?
Like duality, or I was just really fascinated in exploring how you could have something, or even the fact that, a mother raising her son, a black mother raising her black son in the Jim Crow South, and wanting to be so protective of this boy to the extent where you're dressing him like a girl, right? But at the same time, how that can also be detrimental, to him, understanding his manhood, and if you're always dominating him and, controlling him. And so I was just interested, really, really fascinated by that duality.
Yeah, and I asked about the female characters, but you do such an interesting job of writing the male characters too as well. And I think that mother-son relationship is so fraught but unique, and several of your male characters, Jebby especially, he's so babied and coddled by his mother, and yet that allows a certain, not impotence, but just a sort of, he's unable to really be there for the women in his life as he goes forward, and I just found that really well portrayed, the way that, because you understood, though, how he was the way that he was, and then you further understand why Coleman coddled him the way, because she was afraid for him as a black man at that time, and so she wanted to protect him. Beautifully done. I also loved the way you weave Hollywood in through the story. And I mean, that just every few pages, there would be like a pop culture reference from the 1920s to the 1970s somewhere in there. You hear singers like Jelly Roll Morton, Nat King Cole, Whitney Houston, actors like Clark Gable and Rita Hayworth. Various characters are caught singing popular songs, dancing in the dive bar, or going out to the movies. And a true tidbit that is true for one of your family members is that, but relayed as Bertha in the book, names all of her children, or at least from her first relationship, after movie characters. And what is the significance of Hollywood and pop culture, and just why you're weaving that through the book in the way that you do? And, to what effect do you think you employed these cultural icons for the characters?
Yeah, so again, I was just always fascinated by the fact that my grandmother named all of her children after Hollywood stars, including my mother. And so I kind of built around that theme, because I look at this book, it's not necessarily history strong, even though I wanted to be a historian. I wanted to be a PhD, have a a PhD in history, also oral history I was interested in. My next book is research to the, oh my God, it's like a dissertation amount of work that I've done for that book in terms of historical research, cultural research. I had a Fulbright, it's set in Ghana, so I lived there, I interviewed people, so much research for that book. But for Coleman Hill, I guess because growing up with my mother and hearing these stories and getting a sense of like even the language that they would have used, it was so ingrained within me that I didn't really do any, quote, research until like the very, very end. And I was like, oh, maybe I should, because some of the editors like, well, if we could say anything, because this book is so perfect. And I'm like, yes, because I spent so many years of my life working on this book and honing it. They're like, well, we could use some more temporal details. And I was like, okay, fine, I'll just sprinkle in. But, you know, I was building around that theme of Hollywood and pop culture, and particularly with Hollywood, because I figured that, well, what would make a woman name her children after Hollywood stars? Someone who obviously loved movies. You know, so my mother never said like, oh, my mother liked to go to this, you know, movie theater or watch. She never said that. But Greg Coleman's favorite actor was Clark Gable, which is just so bizarre. But it also humanizes her because she's this evil, evil little woman. But then she had a sweet spot for Clark Gable, you know? So yeah, but you know, also looking at African Americans at that time and representation, I mean, even up till the present day, you know, you don't get like a wide or diversified representation of yourself in the movies. And so you identify with these white characters because they're human just like you are. They have loves and hate and, you know, passions and all these kind of things. Stories, just like you. And so, you know, I talked about my grandmother going to see Gone with the Wind, and the fact that because she's darker skinned, she's a big, you know, woman, people are saying, oh, you look just like Hattie McDaniel, you know, like maybe you'll be in the movie too. And she's like, I don't want to be no Hattie McDaniel. I don't want to be no maid. I want to be Scarlett, because Scarlett gets the man, Scarlett gets the love. I want love, you know. And so she, even when she's looking at, you know, Jeppy, I want that romantic, sweet love that I'm seeing in the movies, right? So I wanted to look at that whole angle, how, you know, you're dealt with this pop culture that's not really reflective of you, but you still obviously find something to connect with in this, even as you're excluded from it, right? And the thing with the songs, like I know my grandfather, for example, one of the random things, because music in my mother's family is not a big thing. I love music. That's really coming from my father's people.
You love dancing, too.
And I love dancing.
A lot of dancing in the book,
my mother's
actually.
people. God, good thing I didn't get those genes. That all comes from my father's side. But one thing I know is that my grandfather loved Jelly Roll Morton. I myself fell in love with Jelly Roll Morton when I was in college. We actually did a tap dance piece. I'm a hoofer. Started dancing when I was 3. We did a tap dance piece based off Shelley's Last Jam. And for some reason, the music in that musical was nothing like Jelly Roll Morton's music. But I was like, who is this Jelly Roll Morton guy? And I got like a CD at the time when I was in college. It was CDs, which I still have because I'm old school. I'm a history buff. And I was like, oh my God, Jelly Roll Morton, oh my God. Have you guys listened? Is anyone familiar with Jelly Roll Morton? Oh my God, oh my God. And so, yeah, I had to put that in there to honor that and honor some of these musicians and a lot of the songs, because my parents were a lot older than a lot of my peers' parents. I grew up listening to like 50s pop music, you know, so like, I was able to know some of these songs because these are songs that I listened to, like Caledonia, Louis Jordan. These were songs that I listened to when I was a child. So definitely wanted to add those elements.
Oh, that's great. That's a really, really full answer for, like I said, at first I just thought it was fun. I was like, oh, these pop culture references from a time before I was born. And then I just started to notice how your characters were interacting with them and how it was playing out. So thank you for that answer. All right, we are about to throw it to Q&A, but I do want to take a quick minute and do that lightning round that I said. I think it's so fascinating how you, like you said, you've taken the stories that you've heard growing up and that you've since, through your research, become acquainted with, and photographs and other artifacts from your family, and then you've extrapolated, you filled, like you said, what kind of a person would name her children after movie stars? What else would this person do? What are her desires? What are her motives? What are her fears? What are her dreams? And you've created a full round character from, just a few tidbits. So I'm gonna do quick, 1-2 sentence answers. Give us a snippet of a story or a photograph, something that sparked the kernel or the center of that character for you. Stella Grimes. And you may have already said some of these, so you can just, go for it.
The shotgun in the face.
That's pretty defining, I would say.
And the butter on the table. Because the story that I got was that she was always at conflict with her daughter-in-law, and there were some incidents that were described, and getting sent back to Alabama. Yeah, that had to feature in. Because my great-grandmother was a sweet, sweet person, and the fact that, I was like, how did she live with this, overbearing mother-in-law, and to send her back to Alabama? That must have taken some guts, but she was always this kind of, mild-mannered. All her pictures, she's smiling. She was apparently friends with Coleman, which I was like, how did that happen? Because they were, literally the opposite ends of the spectrum.
Well, I was going to say Lucy Grimes next, who was your great-great-grandmother.
Yes.
And exactly, just seemed the sweetest. And yet she had a few moments where...
Yes. Oh, yes.
All right, Cecilia Coleman, Coleman. What was one of the big moments that got to the kernel of her character for you?
I think probably the story that when the kids plotted to kill her. Yeah, that's the apex.
What would make your grandchildren plot your murder? That's a good question. All right, one final one. I want to know about Nell. I love Nell. What drew you into her character?
I would say the comedy, because she always made everybody laugh at every family gathering. She wanted to be a comedian herself. She wanted to be on stage, like Mom's Mabley, she used to say. And so I was like, and she's one of the few characters, she's the only one besides the first story that came out whose voice I represent in first person. So the book also, beyond being about, from different perspectives, it's also different voices, first person, second person, third person collective. It's narrated in standard English. I read the first section is in dialect. It's just literally my literary arsenal that I'm throwing at readers with everything. But I represented in first person because I knew her voice so well, because she would always tell these stories and jokes and make everyone laugh. So yes, her comedy.
Oh, that's wonderful. All right, I would like to turn it over to the audience if we have a few questions. If you have a question, raise your hand, please. Thank you.
Towards the end of the book, a male character, maybe based on your grandfather, if I'm following, takes the trip down south to discover and look up his family and roots. And I was fascinated and very moved by that section, well, the whole book entirely, but the observations and insights about the sort of what ensued with the family that stayed versus people that went to New Jersey. I was wondering if you could say a few words about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you for that. His story was inspired by my own story. I went down to the South. I went down to Campbellton, Florida, to actually find the same uncle, but to find where he was buried. And so the only evidence that I have that he went down there was a story that my mother said, but I don't know why he went. So I had to kind of figure that out. And I have the photograph. I have the Polaroid that is actually in the book, of him with his uncle. And there's his grandmother. We have another version of that picture. So I'm like, okay, here's the evidence that he actually went. Why he went, I don't know. But because I took that journey myself, I brought down the letter from 1934 that his sister had saved, along with a gazillion other letters, literally letters and letters and letters, was able to find that same family who she had been writing to in 1934. Just Was able to find the undertaker who buried my uncle, because the woman in the family started calling up all her friends, like, do you remember such and such, Mr. Coleman, Mr. Coleman? And talked to the undertaker who buried him. And when I was down there, I was actually with my Grimes extended family. And then we met another cousin. They're like, that's your cousin over there. I'm like, oh, hey, cousin, another cousin. And then incidentally, when we called the undertaker, they're like, oh, we know that undertaker because that cousin that we met on the road, she works for him. I'm like, small, okay. And so when I met the Grimes side of my family, and these are people who never came up to New Jersey. They stayed in the South. And I was so struck by the fact that people in my mother's generation, like most of them had master's degrees. People in my grandparents' generation barely finished high school coming up to Jersey. And you're thinking, oh, but wasn't this the promised land? Wasn't this where you came to get better opportunity? How is it that everyone here has master's degrees? My mother finished high school, that was like the mark, you know? For me, I was the first generation in my family to go to college. How is it that they have master's degrees? And they told me very quickly, they're like, well, everybody left. You know, so that's the paradox. Like, if they had not left, then because, you know, the schools emptied out, the teacher-student ratio went down, we had Black teachers in segregated schools who could not literally work in the white schools. They were invested in us, they pushed us, and that's how we, you know, we did this. And it's not to say that, you know, in the North, like obviously the North literally saved people's lives, literally, right? I myself had white teachers in a predominantly Black elementary school who cared about their Black students, who loved I'm friends with one of my fourth grade teacher. I wrote a novel, one of my novels. In fourth grade, I was writing a novel about her son because, you know, she came in with a story one day about his little hamster. I'm like, okay, I'm gonna write a story about your son.
I need to write about this.
And his hamster. You know, but at the same time, again, they had like that nurturing environment and there was so few of them. But that just always struck me because then I was like, well, what would have happened to my family, my branch of the family, had we stayed in Alabama and Florida? But who's to say?
Thank you for that question. Does anybody else have a question from the audience? Oh, yeah, over here. Do you mind speaking for the recording for later? Thank you. And so we can all hear your wonderful question.
Thank you. I have a question about the familial influence, obviously influencing the whole story, but when you say you're crafting other stories from snippets, do they read it as you're going on, or do you keep them out and then let them see it at the...
No. It was a conscious choice to not let them read because I had been, you know, going to different panels over the years, usually around memoir, you know, because I hadn't seen anyone really doing this through fiction. But people writing about family and memoir. And because I was like, what are the ethics behind this? Like, even though I felt like I had my ancestral experience, what are the ethics putting, you know? And so I learned very quickly that it's kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. You know, some relatives got mad that, you know, they put their business in there. Then another relative would be like, why didn't you talk about me? You talked about everybody else. They're like, I figured you didn't want that. But you talked about everybody else. And I was like, okay. So, so who knows how people are going to react, right? And so I didn't actually tell my family until the first story was about to get published in a literary magazine. I had several excerpts published in literary magazines. I was like, we're at Christmas dinner. The stories about Greg Coleman were flying around the table as always. Your uncle killed the cat in the stove. I'm just like, oh. And I was like, by the way, a story's going to be coming out soon with that. And they're like, and the whole table went quiet. And they're like, you what? And they're like, nobody wants to hear about that crazy mess. I'm like, actually, they do. And so that was the first time I told them that anything was coming together, but I did not let them read anything. I mean, they read it as the stories appeared, and it would just be like radio silence. Because I would send it to everybody. I was like, what did you think? And they'd be like, oh, such and such is such and such, right? And such and such. I'm just like, and? Like, okay, fine.
They're all going to have a different reaction. And like you say, you just do your thing, write the story, and
Yes.
they interact with it how they're going to.
Yes. And so I tell people if anyone's thinking of doing something like this, because I've gotten people approaching me like, oh, I wanted to write about my family or trauma and all this, but how will they react? I'm like, well, you know what? You can't control anything. If you have the impetus to write the story or share the story, you can always put it down on paper and then you decide what to do next. If you'll share it before publication. A lawyer had to read my book. My publisher's lawyer actually had to read the entire book. He vetted all the photographs, basically so I wouldn't get sued by my family, because that's the only one who would care to sue me. And so that was really nerve-wracking, but in the end he's like, yeah, there's nothing really that egregious. I'm like, but the kids tried to plot to kill their grandmother. He's like, it was kind of funny, so.
I'm telling true stories of attempted murder. Are you sure?
He's like, yeah, we know it's kind of like, I'm like, okay. So, so if you are if it does come to publication, your publisher should have like a legal team, because they're concerned about getting sued themselves. So those issues at least will be handled, and I'm happy to say that no one has disowned me. But also, I think that probably a very small portion of my family has actually read the book. I know that people are still reading it, but every time they're like, I read the book, and I'm like, oh God, but you're talking to me. And it's
Check
always
that one
like,
off the list.
But it's always appreciation. Like, I really like what you did. You honor this family, even though you're talking about, some of the horrible things that you did. You're honoring this family, and these are people who never would have seen themselves on the cover of a book. And
Thank you, Kim. Thank you. Now, I just want... I do want to thank you for sharing your family's story in all of the truth, myth, history, that has come together to create this amazing novel, like you said, of trauma and resilience and of just a family's story. We all have a family story. And so this is Kim's as told, fictionalized, and put down in this amazing novel that I hope if you haven't read yet, you go outside and, to quote my friend Sarah DeBello, you can get it signed and make her write anything you want in it. So why wouldn't you? Thank you all for attending. Thank you so much, Kim.